the difficulty is that, if you look at what we call the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who, the people who want to defund the police and all this kind of thing, put an end to the stock market and all this stuff. They're not free traders. They're anything but. So, it's like, well, while you're defunding the police and getting rid of the stock market, get rid of the WTO. Well, okay, well, President Biden has to deal with it. And ironically, on the far right, we get a collection of these types too. The kind of the isolationists who believe that, the United States they always got a raw deal out of all these trade agreements and other international agreements. So they should get out of just about everything. And so somehow the Biden administration has to walk a path between those factions and particularly the progressive Democrats. So I think it makes it a little bit difficult for them. And I don't know that they can swing way over and easily revive the WTO the way we would like to.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Grain Growers of Canada podcast, Beers with Branden. I'm your host, Branden Leslie. This summer series podcast is brought to you by our presenting sponsor, Beer Canada. Beer Canada is the voice of the people who make our nation's beers, and their members account for 90% of the beer produced in Canada. The sale of beer supports 149,000 Canadian jobs, generates $14 billion in gross domestic product, and $5.7 billion in government tax revenues. Beer Canada has represented Canadian brewers since 1943. October 6th is a day we're celebrating. October 6th is Canada Beer Day. You can find out more information at canadabeerday.ca about how you can get involved. Today's guest is an academic and one that is worth listening to. Al Mussell is the research lead for and founder of Agri-Food Economic Systems, an independent economic research organization dedicated to agriculture and food. Their passion and commitment is to high-quality economic research that will help develop a better, more competitive, more sustainable, and more profitable agri-food sector. Prior to establishing Agri-Food Economic Systems, Al was Senior Research Associate at the George Morris Centre in Guelph, Ontario for 15 years. His areas of research expertise are farm management and agricultural systems, agricultural marketing, and agri-food policies. Previously, Al worked as an economist in the Milk Procurement Division of Land O'Lakes Inc. in Minnesota. Al holds bachelor's and master's degrees in agricultural economics from the University of Guelph and a doctorate in agricultural economics from the University of Minnesota, where he was a Fulbright scholar. He is also an alumnus of the International Visitor Leadership Program of the U.S. State Department. Al is a past president of the Canadian Agricultural Economic Society and the Ontario Pork Industry Council, and has served on the board of the Progressive Dairy Operators. Al also served as a member of BioEnterprise's Science and Innovation Advisory Committee. Al, you're a guy that every time I have a conversation with you, I feel like I learned something, and I think others will today too. So Al, thanks so much for joining me here today for another episode of Beers with Branden.
Well, thanks very much, Brandon. Appreciate the opportunity, and I love to talk about ag policy, but actually you had me at beer, so
you're not the first to say that. I don't know why that's such a drawing point.
I can't imagine.
It's kind of a good summertime mix, at the end of the day here, we talk a little ag, we drink a beer for some of these fine products, and we'll get into where we're getting those beers from today. But First off, maybe I'll start with a question here. And, maybe can you tell us what areas of research you and more broadly Agri-Food Economic Systems focus your work on? And then we can kind of dive into some of those issues as we go along here.
Sure. For the last 3 or 4 years, well, I guess maybe I'll start it off this way. We try to go where the needs are of the industry. And over the last 3 or 4 years, the needs have been very strongly in the trade policy and domestic ag policy areas. We also do a lot of work in ag marketing, regulated marketing, and increasingly in what I would call agricultural systems, which sort of range from production economics to sustainability type work.
So has there been a big trend towards sustainability? I mean, we're certainly dealing with that. Are you guys, I know some of the stuff you've put out lately, is that kind of where you see the future going for agri-food economic systems too?
The future is going sort of kind of on all fronts, really. what we're calling sustainability, or increasingly the term that's being used as resilience, that's going to be very important for us. I think most, on the farm side of it, I think most farmers have a fairly, subconscious awareness of this, and it becomes part of everything that you do. I think at the same time, when people from the outside come in and sort of grab hold of one specific aspect, or want to be able to dictate this or that standard, I think there's a natural pushback from the farm community, which is understandable, because I think it's sort of implicitly understood, and it's out there already. And really, we're probably going to get into this further, but as we get into some of the mounting challenges around carbon and climate change, and some of the other issues around weeds, animal diseases, animal health, et cetera, this is going to be more and more important to us. But it's going to end up being okay, because in my understanding, farmers generally come to this naturally, but we just all have to work together, and not sort of have people being told.
Well, I mean, that's somewhat relevant here to, I guess, kind of a next question. We have an election underway right now, and it seems at times our country's more divided than ever. So what role do you think agriculture can have in healing that division, or bringing the country together? Can ag be kind of a uniting feature for our country?
Oh, I believe it can, Branden. And part of the reason I say that is, we have forged a national ag policy in the past out of what was essentially fragmented provincial or regional policy. Agriculture is, in my understanding of it, uniquely positioned to be able to do this, because it is, along with immigration, it's the only constituency or jurisdiction that is actually a joint responsibility of federal and provincial government. So maybe I'll put it this way: when we take that to heart, and we understand that in the agriculture file, provincial governments, producer associations, different commodities have an opportunity to work together and forge a national view, a national vision, and a national ag policy. We can do that in agriculture, whereas in another industrial sector, or let alone another social sector, that wouldn't really be possible in quite the same way. Now, with that comes a caution, of course, which is the ag portfolio can fall victim to provincialism or regionalism, in which you've got provinces or commodities competing with one another in a damaging fashion. We can fall victim to that very easily as well. So, I've come to understand that it's probably going to be a theme in some of my responses to your questions. People have to be able to work together. We have to realize that there's a lot that can be accomplished through a national agenda, but it can also fall apart quite badly. So there is a risk to it.
That's a really interesting point, and I think it's unfortunately true. So what do you think, how does that vision come about then? I know folks like us and folks like yourself, and many other parts of the sector are kind of working on what we believe to be our sector's vision, and then the larger agricultural sector. But what needs to drive that vision and for that to happen?
Well, I'll draw upon some recent work published by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute by my colleague Douglas Headley, in which he describes the dynamic in the late 1980s, in which we were fortunate to have a federal minister of agriculture who was also the deputy prime minister, who could drive an agenda like perhaps no one else. And he could see that producers were not treated equally in different parts of the country, across different commodities. And particularly with regard to access to federal funds, that was not a viable situation, wasn't fair, and would ultimately lead to very bad provincialism, and I'm not sure what else. So out of that period of time, we built the Farm Income Protection Act, later the Whitehorse Agreement, which some people will remember at one point in time we had different arrangements between the federal government and all the provinces on crop insurance. There were a sequence of one-offs in such a way that if a province decided to introduce crop insurance for another crop, it could end up influencing the funding available to another province, and you could get resentment around things like that. We cleaned all that up, and eventually we got to a point in the early 2000s. Some people will remember the ADA program, which led to the Canadian Farm Income Program, and these whole farm programs, which I understand they've come under some criticism of late for a variety of good reasons, actually, but that we could come to a national set of farm programs that essentially applied uniformly across the country was really a remarkable achievement. So we can do this. Now the converse is, we can go back to fighting over money under tripartite or the various grain programs that came about. Provinces can try to lure processing plants away from one another, and I fear that it's just too small a country to attract meaningful investment in processing and grain handling and things like that if provinces are going to fight with one another and pit one another off against each other. So we have to be able to work together, and I think it's a very important challenge. People need to be thinking about that.
Well, that's a good segue, because I'm kind of curious. When you speak of those business risk management programs, or BRMs, which are obviously incredibly relevant right now in the current state of agriculture, with much of Western Canada and parts of Ontario and BC facing serious drought problems, and some fears that that's going to be a problem next year as well if we don't get some fall moisture. So, we're in the midst of some of those consultations on that next policy framework right now, obviously a little bit on pause with the election, but there's a lot of recognition about some significant reforms being required for those programs. So I'm curious kind of what your views are on those suite right now, and what we need going forward for the next both 5, 10, 15 years going forward. What do those programs need to look like to allow farmers to achieve success?
Well, I'll go back to how we got the program suite that we've had since essentially since 2003, the original ag policy framework. Those depended first on a recognition and cooperation between provincial and federal governments, as well as the various general farm organizations and commodity organizations, that we would have fair and equal access to federal funds spent in what we, at the time, we called them safety nets. Now we call it business risk management. It's the same thing. And the other thing that was an aspect of that is what happened following the Canada-U.S. trade agreement, NAFTA, and then the World Trade or the Uruguay Round Agreement on Agriculture and WTO agreements. We could go forward with an understanding that there would be disciplines on other countries' subsidies. So then we could kind of structure our own BRM type programs with the knowledge of what everybody else was going to do, what they were committed to do, and also the fact that we were going to have material market access, so we could ramp up our export-oriented sectors, particularly in Western Canada, with some assurance that we were going to have market access for these products. The dilemma we face today is a lot of those conditions have changed. With regard to the domestic support component, one of the, if not the most influential country, one of the most influential is the U.S. And the U.S. Since 2018, we know has just augmented supports to agriculture far beyond what was ever in the Farm Bill. And in some quarters, we had some concerns about those structured programs that were in the Farm Bill as well. But these, I don't know how many times we can repeat ad hoc programs before we have to stop calling them ad hoc, but that's what these are, right up to, well, just the other day we had an announcement of $500 million for, I guess it's going to be for small meat processing plants or something like that. But this just continues on and on and on. And we have to worry greatly about this because we're wide open on this, and we don't have the treasury nor the structure to match them. The other thing, of course, that we've experienced the burn firsthand from is the changes, practically speaking, to market access. So we've had our issues with China. We also have we've had some concerns with the direction taken on the U.S. by the U.S. and particularly their blocking of panelists to the WTO appeals panel, which means that when you get in a dispute with when you get a dispute with anybody, I guess, but particularly a dispute with the United States, it can only go so far, and then it just gets parked. It never gets resolved. And so, thinking now about our direction on BRM, we knew by the mid 90s, we knew sort of the pathway we wanted to embark on with our business risk management programming, where we wanted to go. We were going to live in a world with less domestic support of agriculture by other countries, and we were going to live in a world with much better known and predictable market access. Both of those conditions have changed now. Throw on top of that, and I very much hope this is just an aberration of the current year, but the weather risk that we're having to live with, and I realize it's simply disastrous for some people. Maybe this is a crazy year, but the worry is that it isn't. If it isn't, well, then that's a moving piece as well. So look, you can't go into a situation like that with tweaks to existing programming. You have to go back in and say, well, look, if the world is changing, we have to change with it. And that's a big job.
That was very well said. You touched on a lot of things that I'm going to come back to you on, including, the market access issues in China. But first, you look a little thirsty. So I'm wondering if you'd like to try one of these beers. It's from, a brewery down in your neck of the woods. So if you're up for it, we can sample one of the fine products we're going to be drinking from Waterloo Brewing today. Waterloo Brewing is located in Kitchener and opened its doors in 1984 and is credited with pioneering the present-day craft brewing renaissance in Canada as Ontario's first craft brewery. Waterloo boasts a team of skilled brewers who are dedicated to brewing the kind of beer that they would be proud to bring home to their friends and family. Their state-of-the-art brew house is one of the greenest in North America and produces 750,000 hectoliters per year. In 2019, Waterloo opened their tap house, which not only has delicious food, but houses a small batch system where their brewers produce experimental draft offerings exclusively available there. At any time, they have 6 different rotating brews on tap to try. Alongside their award-winning Waterloo Brewing craft beers, they also produce Laker, Seagram Coolers and Cider, and Landshark Lager and Seltzer. You can find their products at the LCBO, the beer store, and at your local grocery store across Ontario. This year, they launched Locals Helping Locals, a new program that aims to help local business owners and hospitality workers recover after having their doors shut for so long. They're selling kegs and tall cans of their most popular brands at significantly reduced costs to restaurants, bars, and pubs across Ontario. Now, Al, I don't know about you, but I love that sense of community amongst craft brewers, and that Locals Helping Locals is a great example of that. So let's start with our first beer from Waterloo, if you'd like.
For sure.
First up, we are going to start with the Waterloo Grapefruit Rattler. This Rattler is Ontario's best-selling Rattler and blends real grapefruit juice and their craft lager for a crisp refreshment with an ever so slightly bitter finish. So let's have a sip and cheers to you, Al.
Cheers.
Okay. That is what I needed on this hot day.
Likewise.
That is, I'm actually not normally a grapefruit guy, but it's not an overpowering grapefruit. It's
fantastic. And it's 32 degrees here where I am. Not the best ventilated place in the world. It hits the spot.
Well, I actually, why don't you told me an interesting story. Where are you now? Your office is located on a farm now. You've recently moved, have you not? Where are you? You're in a barn.
Yeah, I had an office in Guelph, Ontario, and like many other people, and during the pandemic, I wasn't using the office much, so I was looking for some other options. And a friend of mine bought the cows and milk quota at the farm next door to me, which is in I think it's a 3-year-old freestall barn, and they put quite a nice office in these barns. So basically, he's a vet. He's on the road all day, so I'm something like the daytime manager at this farm. And I go back to doing some farm work, and then he gives me the office. So it's a good deal.
Love it. You see, you're not just an academic, you're grounded in reality. And I think that's probably why some of these views you hold are also grounded in reality. So I can appreciate.
Well, you know, it's been almost 30 years since I was day to day on the farm, and I'm enjoying it very much,
I
actually.
bet. It's nice to get back. I love being around the farm this summer around harvest and stuff. It's quite the way of life, and I miss it. But I'm glad you get to live it here every day. But so maybe we'll get back to a couple of the policy related questions, and sticking on the domestic before we get into some of those trade issues you kind of briefly mentioned there. I know you've done quite a bit of work on carbon pricing in Canada, and as it relates to agriculture. And I'm kind of curious your thoughts on the continued impact of carbon pricing on agriculture going forward, and in particular, if it keeps rising at the current projected rates up to $170 a ton by the end of the decade here.
Right. So I think I'd sort of fragment this into two components, and then within one component, a sort of a different fragmentation. So I've been doing some work to help the Ontario Federation of Agriculture understand what some of the costs associated with this could be. I've tried to break it down into explicit costs and implicit costs. So explicit costs are the costs that farmers actually pay. So you know, you got an exemption on fuels used in farm equipment, but what you don't have an exemption on is heating fuels for buildings, fuels in drying. Then you have, you know, then in the greenhouse sector, they have an 80% exemption on fuels used to heat greenhouses, but that means there's still 20% of it that's remaining. You know, when you go through this, and I'm not going to get into the detail of it, but these are material costs. They're material costs on grain growers of Canada, grain farmers of Ontario have each done work on the costs of the carbon tax and grain drying, and I think that's been made very known and available to people, and these are simply very material costs, and that's in an ordinary year. And you know, some of us remember 2019 as being a very wet and challenging harvest in really throughout the country, actually. And when you get into a year like that, it's that much worse. You know, even with an 80% exemption, we think there's a heavy cost burden that ends up being borne by the greenhouse sector, because of course, you know, you're heating buildings with natural gas, and also using natural gas as a source of carbon dioxide for plants to grow. The other aspect of this is the implicit costs, and you know, so agriculture has an exemption on, let's say, diesel fuel, but the trucking industry, your trains, ocean freight, et cetera, do not. Well, when you try to work that through the system, you know, there's as we've gotten more and more into your just-in-time inventory type systems, and people, you know, ordering a lot of things from Amazon, et cetera. For comparison, if you go back to the 1970s and the energy crisis, when fuel prices rose materially, they parked trucks. So in other words, there was a demand response in terms of reduced use of transportation services. Today, that seems to be not the case at all. I mean, you know, if you order something from Amazon and it's supposed to arrive here in 3 days, well, you still expect it's going to arrive here in 3 days. So what ends up happening is, to a much greater degree than historically was the case, when you get fuel surcharges put on, or however it's done with trucking rates, that ends up being passed through into the price of consumer products, including expenditures that farmers pay, to a much greater extent. We think it's, well, the literature would tell us it's somewhere around 25%. Well, if you go and, you know, and the simple analysis, and you know, take this with a grain of salt, but because it's based on some, you know, like 10-year long-term outlook, but over the 10-year period, there isn't looking to be a material increase in oil prices, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture outlook. But in Canada, really, and again, there's not a long-term outlook on the dollar that says that we're going to have some dramatically strengthening dollar that would hold down whatever inflation due to fuel prices would occur. That doesn't seem to be on the horizon. But what is on the horizon is the carbon tax. And we think that that could be the leading driver of inflation in fuel prices. Well, if that's the case, then, I think, for the farmers that view this, just go through the line items of things that you are buying. Machinery parts, repairs, the trucking services that you use yourself, your supplies, all the various consumer items, like, for example, on this farm here, we're buying milking supplies and all those kinds of things. Well, the inflation from that carbon tax will go directly into those. We think at a rate of about 25 cents on the dollar. Now, and what has been done, the current government, well, I guess I should say the previous government, because we're in an election, through the tax system, there were exemptions and credits given to households predicated on how the carbon tax would increase the expenditures of households. And it's a little bit different in every province for a whole range of reasons. They didn't do that for the farm economy, but you think about the farm household is going to experience a lot of the same consumer price inflation that an urban household would. But then, of course, for the farm side of it, there's any number of supplies, trucking, machinery parts, almost anything that you buy will end up, if it's trucked or rail freight or what have you, it's going to be subject to this. And we don't really have an accounting for that. And we think that's quite material. And it's interesting. When I was working on this, I spoke to one of my colleagues at the Grain Farmers of Ontario, and he said, we think that hidden cost of the inflation on farm expenditures, that could be worse than the grain drying. And it's turning out that perhaps it is.
We're absolutely seeing prices rise, and all consumers are, and we've seen that amongst food prices. What sort of a factor do you think is that just going to further increase those food prices as we go along here? I've seen a recent report; they were up 3.7% in last month, I believe. Is that just going to continue to pile on with that combination of carbon tax driving inflation?
Yeah, one of the challenges we have, of course, is that farmers are poorly positioned to pass on these costs. So how this plays out, one of the worries, of course, that we have is that you get in a position that we've got imported product that is not subject to the carbon tax the same way that our product is. And, I suppose that acts to mitigate the consumer price inflation. But on the farm, for the farm community and the ag industry in Canada, it not only doesn't benefit them, it's an issue of competitiveness, right? So one of the things that we worry about a little bit, the U.S. does not have a carbon tax. It appears as though the approach that they are, I could be more definitive than that. They're going to have standards, but the industry is going to be given support to comply with the standards. Now, President Biden campaigned on having carbon border adjustments to deal with the competitive issues that their carbon regulation would have. At this point, I don't see how this is avoidable. We're going to need to have something to protect ourselves, but we have the difficulty, which, it's interesting during the election, both conservatives and liberals are behind a carbon tax because I think it's understood that this is the most efficient way to address climate change issues. But the problem you have is if the U.S. isn't going to do this, can you imagine what it would be like if we had a differential carbon, if we didn't have a common carbon border adjustment? So we're going to have to find somewhere to get there. But the logic of the two carbon regulatory systems is very different. So you're going to have to take our system, which is a carbon tax-based system, and theirs, which is a regulatory standard and support system, and somehow mesh them together, because you'd have, we've got such an integrated ag and food economy for the most part that trying to get them to work together otherwise would be exceptionally difficult.
And I'd have to think, I'm pretty confident this is two governments that are their governments. That's going to take years. Well, we face the increased price, as currently stated, that will continue to rise. So the prospect of aligning those two in short order seems like a large challenge. But I'd like to ask you about, when you talk about that consumers are perhaps the benefactors and farmers are often the ones bearing those implicit costs. What does that mean to farm size in Canada? I think it's fair to say through, general farm economics, particularly economies of scale, farms are expanding in size, and that's due to large or high operating costs and slim margins. So farms are getting bigger by necessity. But that said, there's something to be said about keeping people on the land and our rural communities kind of thriving and alive. So what are your thoughts on, I guess, more broadly, that trend of expansion of farms, and what does that look like going forward, especially as we have these increased operating costs in every asset of the operation?
Yeah, so I believe the high water mark for the number of farms in Canada was in 1941. It's been going down ever since. The arable land base has not changed nearly as much. So just simple arithmetic, the average farm size has been increasing. This is a long run trend. What we have to ask ourselves, though, is, there's some sense that, year in and year out, well, some of the small farms become medium-sized farms. Some of the medium-sized farms become large farms. Some large farms become very large farms. And if that were true, then it would just be sort of a matter that the distribution of farms according to economic size would just sort of every year just kind of march along, and everybody's getting a little bigger. The census data suggests to us that that's not what's happening. What is happening is you've got some movement from large to very large, and very large that continue to grow in size. The small farms seem to be struggling. It's still most of, and I think small farms, I think we count as more less than 100,000 in sales. That's still by far most of the farms. I think it's over 50% of the farms, but they continue to go down. What's disappearing is the middle. And I wonder what that means in a number of respects. The one thing I've been thinking about recently, actually, my colleague Douglas Headley and I we're working on a paper we have coming out on this, is, particularly in grains and oilseeds, where a big determinant of size and perhaps even a barrier to entry into the business is machinery. The machinery's gotten quite expensive. But, we sort of, the larger farms can acquire machinery based on, basically the difference between the new machine and the trade-in value. Smaller farms, and again, my return to day-to-day farming, I can see it myself. New machinery is maybe not out of reach, but almost. So you're looking at the used market. I wonder how long we can continue to drive down the small and medium-sized farm and have the large expand before eventually the market for used machinery that fuels that ability to acquire new machinery based on basically the difference with your trade-in. I wonder how long that can be sustained. Logically, there will reach a point where it begins to give. That's worrisome, not only for some of the reasons you said, having people on the land and people support rural communities and so on. But actually, if that used machinery market starts to give, and I'm sure there'll plenty of people will say, yeah, but used machinery is expensive because the price of new brings up used with it. And I realize that's true. But we have to face the fact that the demographics of the demand for used machinery is not promising, because usually the largest, most efficient farms aren't buying used equipment. But if that used market starts to give, then their ability to buy new equipment and invest will also give with it, because the spread between new and used will just widen, and the cost of paying the difference for the new machine just gets that much more onerous.
It's an interesting point, and perhaps enhanced right now with this super semiconductor shortage. I mean, driving up the cost of used equipment due to a shortage of new equipment. So that almost might kind of exasperate that trend a little bit more quickly. Well, I think we should maybe pause and try a second beer if that's okay with you.
Well, I'm good with it.
I love that attitude. So for this one, we're gonna try the. This is an interesting one. I don't think I've ever tried a beer like this, to be honest with you. It's the Waterloo Salted Caramel. It's a seasonal beer back for its 4th year, and it's a 6% alcohol where rich, creamy caramel and a savory sprinkling of sea salt come together to make this deep brown porter. With roasted malts for a smooth, balanced brew, it's got just enough sweetness to set you right for the night and is the perfect finish to any holiday feast. Now, I apologize. I did not ship you a holiday early Thanksgiving dinner in advance here, but I think we're going to be able to find a way to enjoy this despite that. So cheers to you, Al. Well, that's that's a good flavor.
Yeah, that's good.
That is not what I expected.
No, me neither. But
I didn't
wow,
know
it's
what to
good.
expect, but that's a nice balance. Got that little bit of sweet, that little bit of salt.
Indeed.
Well, we're trying all sorts of new things here today, Al. I appreciate that. So let's go to government policy making here for a bit. And you've been
Mhm.
working in the policy realm for many years, and so I think you're well kind of positioned to comment on how government operates. And I would say it seems that officials within government many really have no idea how a farm works. Yet they're tasked with creating and implementing policy that could have major impacts on farmers. And I think specifically to departments that, previously it was just the ag department that, farmers would in theory have to deal with, but now there's a number of other departments. And I can't blame these folks for not understanding agriculture. If you work in the environment department, you've never really had any access to the industry. But the fact is that they don't and they need to. So, what are your thoughts on kind of this progression of government's knowledge and understanding of agriculture, and how do we seek to improve that?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem, Brandon. So there was a point in time in the federal system in many provinces, in which government staff progressed through the Department of Agriculture, and many of those people came from farms or were connected to agriculture in some fundamental way, and well, in this day and age, people rarely, in my understanding of it, rarely stay within the same department. They tend to get moved around across departments, and of course, there's far fewer farm people from which to draw people who will come in and take on government jobs. So that's a challenge. I think there's I guess another point is we maybe take it for granted, but to others, this is a very complicated file. If you're kind of coming from outside of it, it can seem very complicated, and depending on where you land as staff in government, you may find that your primary exposure sort of is to the kind of the troublemakers. So if lucky you're on the handling crop insurance appeals or appeals under ag stability or something. You may feel that gee, these guys are trying to put one over on us. They're crooks, and of course they're not. But I mean, that's the impression that you get, and you don't maybe get the window into the totality of the great industry that it is. There's another aspect of this that I think I'm just maybe starting to develop an understanding of, and I've been reading this book by Donald Savoy, the political scientist, in which he's talking about regionalism in Confederation in Canada. And one of the things that he spends a lot of time discussing is how it was through the 1930s and 40s. challenges around the Canadian Constitution seem to come down to provincial authorities, broadly speaking. So if there was a dispute between federal and provincial authorities, your judicial decisions seem to inherently find provincial authority. But of course, provinces have never had a great deal of taxation authority to fund those responsibilities. Federal government has that. So what developed was, how to get around this? Well, so we get federal provincial agreements. Well, federal provincial agreements in agriculture are natural because it's a matter of joint jurisdiction. But in other areas, like social programs and natural resources and other things, they're not joint response. So these had to be done on an ad hoc basis. And what would happen would be, and this clearly applies to agriculture. What would happen would be, well, the federal government doesn't have an authority in an area, provinces do. They will fund provinces to do certain things on a program basis if they meet federal standards. So a good example is healthcare. So we have federal funding of provincial healthcare, but those provincial healthcare programs have to meet federal standards. And one of the core standards, for example, is transferability. So if I live in one province and I'm using that province's healthcare system and I move to another province, then there's continuity in that coverage. What has happened over time is provinces have become dependent on this. So, a provincial minister will say, well, look, my province needs X, Y, and Z. I'm going to go to the federal government and we'll just do a joint program to get the resources to make that happen. And they periodically get told that, well, no, what you want to do doesn't meet the federal standard. And it's crazy because you'll have a provincial minister meeting with bureaucrats in Ottawa and they say, well, wait a minute, and they'll go to the federal minister. The federal minister says, well, nothing I can do. These are standards that are developed by my senior staff, and you got to live with them. The reason I get into this is you can begin to understand what happened over about the last 20 years, somewhat in the Chrétien government, more so in the Harper governments, in which you had the politicians, wanting to take back government from the bureaucracy. That's where that dynamic came from. And the legacy of that dynamic is you get into, in my experience, departments of agriculture fall into this, as well as I assume other line departments in government, where officials, they don't want to take any risks. They want to keep their head down. They want to find out what their job is. Look, I'll be here at 8:30 in the morning. I'm going to be here till 4:30. I'll do what I'm told, but I'm not doing any more than that. Because if I do, I stick my head up, well, somebody's liable to pick me off. And it's great fun at the coffee shop to make fun of government bureaucrats and so on. But I think we need to understand the world that they live in, and that world has been shaped by the broader politics.
That is a fair point. I think there's a lot of criticism thrown about, but that is fair to say that the system doesn't allow for it from an employee standpoint, from how to move up in that system. It's not structured that way. You might, and to your point, yeah, you move around between departments, and that doesn't lend itself to any level of expertise. Not that there are not experts in ag, and other departments have their own experts. Don't get me wrong, but
no, and I would, just to people who watch our conversation, Brandon, my experience has been in the extension service in provinces that I worked. These are some of the best people around, exceptionally knowledgeable and driven by a mission to really help people. Also in the research branches, we've got some great researchers. So you don't want to color everybody with the same cloth.
Absolutely. And I had a chance in Manitoba to go to meet with some of those folks, and yeah, absolutely. And that's what we need. And it just, at times it doesn't seem that Ottawa offers that. And I think that's a long-standing criticism of what happens in Ottawa is kind of a top down and a lack of understanding of what goes on the ground. And that's kind of the reality that we live in. And as you mentioned, they live in. But in that vein, the term evidence-based policy is tossed around by governments all the time. And we all agree that, yes, that's what we need. However, that is not always the case. Recently, we saw a decision taken about maximum residue limits for glyphosate that isn't based on the evidence at all. And it was a political decision before an election, to be frank. So will governments ever get back to evidence-based decision making? Is this a worrying trend in your view?
Well, of course, it's a worrying trend. This is a tough one. I think the best way to respond to that issue is to say this is a question of integrity in process and belief in process and institutions. So, we have a system of product regulatory approvals. The industry has had concerns in the past, well-founded, that process can be slow, expensive, but generally not arbitrary. It's science-based. And when we get into messing with that, you really worry about where that's going to take us. Just to try and connect a couple of dots here. This past weekend, there was an article in the New York Times talking about this new, they're calling it a new superweed, Palmer amaranth, which I looked at it and I said it's pigweed. Anyway, there's like, well, in southwestern Ontario here, we've got two varieties of pigweed that I'm aware of. Maybe there's some others, but I guess there's a lot of different pigweeds. But anyway, this pigweed is glyphosate resistant, it's dicamba resistant. They say it's going to be, because of some aspects of it, it's going to be resistant to stacked herbicides that haven't even been developed yet, which is a really, really worrying thought. When we're living in that environment, where we have challenges like that coming, let alone the climate extremes, which we're experiencing this year and perhaps are going to be much more frequent and severe. Like, look, you can't afford to play politics with stuff like this. This New York Times article, which I think it warrants reading for anybody who's interested. They also make reference to the fact that I think most people know this. In the 1970s and 80s, weed resistance, insect resistance, et cetera, that was a problem, but you always knew that the pipeline was filling with new chemistries coming forward all the time. It appears as though that's much less the case today. And when you make it more difficult for the pharmaceutical industry to operate because you're going to have changes in regulation that are not science-based, or in other cases, you're going to allow petty lawsuits that even when they settle the lawsuits are costing, most recently a Bayer Crop Science on glyphosate issues, it's costing billions of dollars. These aren't just write-offs. Like it has to affect their thinking of how they reinvest in agriculture. So yeah, it's worrying. We can wear out and undo the integrity of our regulatory institutions if we keep playing this game.
That was well said. And I think those are two important contributing factors. And as you said, you think about, okay, well, maybe there's another chemistry coming, but if companies in this space are dissuaded from wanting to move forward for a variety of commercial and or political government reasons, that's a problem.
Well, and we're not helped by our history because many of us, I'm in my early 50s, but people older than me and I, I remember when Roundup came out. I think it was 1978. But look, we had 2,4-D, and 2,4-D had some didn't always work and had some undesirable circumstances. But then we had atrazine, we had dicamba, we had all of these things that came through the system, and it seemed like there was always a new one coming. Well, there isn't. And on the animal health product side, it's been like that for a while. And the best example are your intestinal parasite treatments for sheep and cattle, in which basically there's three, and there's no others forthcoming. And we just kind of hope for the best. We change them up and hope that you don't get resistance.
Well, on that dour note, perhaps we should try our third beer of the day.
Yep.
This one is the third of the day here is going to go back to where it all began in 1984 for the brewery with the Waterloo Dark. This award-winning dark lager embodies everything Waterloo stands for as Ontario's first craft brewer. Created under their principles of quality and craftsmanship, this light-tasting dark lager delivers flavors of roasted malt with smooth cocoa notes. Now, this one, have you tried this one? This is kind of their staple. I don't think I've had the chance. Al, have you tried this before?
Oh yeah, I've had it before. It's good. Yeah, yeah, you'll like it.
Well, I like the sounds of that confidence, and if it's anything judged by the first two, I think I will here. Well, cheers to you, Al. Oh, that is good. It's light. I see why that's their flagship, their staple that got them where they are today.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, all right, Al. China. China is soon to be the biggest economy in the world. It's simply too big of a trading partner to ignore. However, I'll be frank, there's much of a challenge as an opportunity here. So before we get into kind of trade specifically, I'd like to get your kind of general thoughts on China's role in the world economy, and perhaps your thoughts on, and maybe a bit of an explanation of, for those that aren't as familiar, their Belts and Roads Initiative and what that might mean in the bigger picture of things.
Yeah, sure. So, in my understanding of it, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is based almost solely on its ability to deliver somewhere in excess of 5% GDP growth reliably over a long period of time. So you stop and think about that. Well, here we are. We think we're a pretty developed country, a G7 country. Yeah, we're not developed. We're not delivering 5 or 6% GDP growth over time. It's been some time since we've been able to do that. So that's what they're committed to. They have to pull out all the stops to do it, and it's going to be more and more difficult for them over time for a variety of reasons. Relative to their population, their natural resource base is limiting, and I'll come back and talk about the ag and food part of that in a moment. But for example, anybody who's read about the many and several disputes, including trade disputes that they have with Australia, they're absolutely dependent on metals aren't something I'm real knowledgeable about, but it's Australian iron. They need Australian iron in their mills. They don't have the same grade or what have you, so they have to go get that elsewhere. Coal, they need to get coal elsewhere. They're trying to cut back on coal, of course, because coal's dear, but I don't know to what extent they can do that. It's kind of like their economy is under the gun all the time. And given that, it's a little bit like that ends justifies the means. So, the Belt and Road Initiative is, one of my colleagues likened it to the Marshall Plan for China. So this is their economic development path, is to sort of create extensions of themselves through infrastructure and other kinds of investments into other countries, so that they can draw from the natural resource base, primarily, of other countries. Some people would call it mercantilism or economic colonialism, and I think there's probably some examples where the examples that can be drawn from. Turning now to the ag and food side of this, it's incredible to think, but at this point we know that China cannot feed itself, really. The most recent, they have this, and it's just as an aside, it's interesting. In Canadian government or U.S. government, strategies for agricultural development are developed by largely by the bureaucracy, and politicians and elected officials come in and weigh in on that and help to shape it and so on, but the permanent home of that is in government itself. In China, it's not like that. It's done by the Communist Party. So the most recent Communist Party ag strategy, it's called this so-called, I think it's the #2 document, it's referred to as. Basically they come out and say, we need to choose land use between food grains, which means rice and wheat, or feed grains. We can't do both. Well, for a country with a pretty healthy appetite for protein, particularly pork, that is a very concerning situation. Secondly, of course, they went through this devastating pig disease. I shouldn't say went through; they're still languishing with it. But by mid-year 2020, something like 50% or 60% of their pig herd had either died of this disease or been culled. And the rough, roughly speaking, 50% of the world's pig herd is in China. So if 50% of 50% are dead, so that means 25% of the global stock of pigs died as a result of this. They're absolutely up against it with regard to food security. Well, then you may ask them, well, why do they jerk us around? How can they afford to do that? Well, I heard it once said that they play a bad hand very well. So, there's enough moving parts and enough things going on that, so they will mix in their own logistical challenges, worries about COVID-19 spread, et cetera, as means to set up roadblocks that allow them to forestall what's eventually coming. Like eventually, they are going to need Canadian product. They need Canadian protein, meat protein in particular. They need oilseed product. They need feed grains. Probably also need food grains. They definitely need feed grains. But they see it as being in their interest to sort of keep this highly uncertain, and we never know where they're coming from. They can whatever sneak up on us, surprise us, etc. And that's a way that they have leverage over us. So it's a little bit like, that may sound like a convoluted explanation of things. The reason it's convoluted is it's not as simple as A, B, C. It's a more complicated situation than that, my understanding of it.
So how do we deal with it? You're the prime minister tomorrow. Is it further increasing alignment with our allies to better manage that wild card that's playing a bad hand, or what's the path forward in your view?
I think it's exactly that. It's a couple things. Renewal of the WTO in a meaningful manner that would meet some of the U.S. concerns. Some of the U.S. concerns, by the way, are Canada's concerns as well, with WTO and the WTO dispute resolution mechanism that can rein in some aspects of how the Chinese operate. That's an important element. But apart from that, if you had a type of alliance among food exporting countries that sort of could say, look, we aren't going to use access to food as a weapon because that's not ethical. But look, if you want to be able to import food from our group of countries on an ongoing basis, we expect ethical behavior on behalf of you. And that hasn't developed yet.
Now, you mentioned that China isn't the only country that has challenges with rules-based global trade. You mentioned the U.S. and not appointing members to the appellate body, the WTO. Is there a path forward to reform of the WTO? Do you actually see that, or is this, we have two, I'll call them bullies. You got America and China that often don't want to necessarily play by the rules when it doesn't suit them. So are we going to be able to see this, or is this kind of the end of this world-based or global rules-based order?
Well, I sure hope not. I think we should acknowledge Canada and in particular some of the officials at Global Affairs Canada for really taking the lead with the so-called Ottawa group that has been working on some of the issues around the WTO and reviving that system. I guess I'm of two minds as it comes to the U.S. President Biden, and in my understanding of members of President Biden's team, and quite a number of these people, they are multilateral people. They like to work with other countries. They know how to deal with allies, which is quite apart from their predecessors. So that's promising. The difficulty is that if you look at what we call the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who the people who want to defund the police and all this kind of thing, put an end to the stock market and all this stuff. They're not free traders. They're anything but. So it's like, well, while you're defunding the police and getting rid of the stock market, get rid of the WTO. Well, okay. Well, President Biden has to deal with it, and ironically, on the far right, we get a collection of these types too. The kind of the isolationists who believe that the United States they always got a raw deal out of all these trade agreements and other international agreements, so they should get out of just about everything. And so somehow the Biden administration has to walk a path between those factions and particularly the progressive Democrats. So I think it makes it a little bit difficult for them, and I don't know that they can swing way over and easily revive the WTO the way we would like to. So I think we continue to grind away at that. The alternatives for us, frankly, Branden, are not great. Maybe we can look at elevating food and agriculture as part of Canada's foreign policy and using that to seek out new allies and things like that on a bilateral basis in which the WTO system and multilateral has kind of degraded quite badly. That's certainly a second best world, but I think we would be foolish to not contingency plan for it, put it that way.
An unfortunate reality. So, you mentioned the Biden walking a tough line here, and we think back. You mentioned some of those payments from Trump, those ad hoc payments to American farmers. That in a couple of years, when those numbers kind of come through the WTO, they might well be outside of their green box funding. Like they're not in a position that they might not want to have a functioning WTO. But do you think Joe Biden? Former
USDA chief economist Joe Glauber has called them out. They've said 2019 they're over unambiguously, and if they're over in 2019, they're going to be over in 2022.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so there's going to be no surprise here. One of the interesting political questions: what are we going to do with that bombshell when it lands? Because it's coming. Yeah. Are we going to say, or are we going to go? Are we going to challenge the U.S.? We don't want to be challenging the U.S. all the time. They're our largest trading partner, but it makes it very difficult for us to handle it.
So do you think Biden's going to continue that path for electoral reasons? I mean, he didn't win all those states, so there's...
Well, we knew that, he doesn't have a great deal of choice, I don't think. Much and all as we'd like him to back off on a lot of this stuff because it's ultimately counterproductive from a variety of respects. I don't know. He needs to win Iowa. He needs to win. He had a very tight vote in Wisconsin. There's Midwest states in particular. He needs to be able to carry them. And if he was remembered as the guy who took a hatchet to the government check that I was getting, well, that doesn't help his electoral chances much. So I think he's maybe in a little bit tough. And I wish I could say it differently because I'd certainly like these things to disappear because it's terrible news for us.
Yeah. No, absolutely trade distorting. When we think maybe outside of, or to, more broadly, we see this protectionist movement particularly through COVID. I think it was happening before. And well, I mean, personally, I don't agree with it. I think I understand the reason and theory for it from a domestic political standpoint in some countries. But the reality is that we're facing tough growing conditions across much of the world. I mean, you look at rising grain prices, for example, it's not because Canada's had a drought. It's because, China's had flooding. It's Argentina and Brazil have had frosts. The Black Sea's having a tough time. Like there's problems everywhere. Is this a long-term trend though, in your view, or is this kind of a symptom of the global pandemic, or will that fade as we recognize COVID to be endemic and things kind of, that's the new reality? What do you think in that frame?
So, for the current year, I think that's a little bit of a question for the weathermen, and some days I think rather than doing economic forecasts, I'd be better off being a weatherman. But anyway, boy, you sure hope that this year is an aberration. However, something else has changed, and maybe it is related to the pandemic. There is much more willingness on behalf of countries as well as companies and individual citizens to get into habits and practices or policies in some cases of what amounts to hoarding or attempting to manage food security within your own walls type thing, which only further exacerbates the distortions that we've had from the pandemic and the disruption in global food supply chain, now exacerbated by what appears to be climate change based droughts and other poor growing conditions. But I was reading something the other day here again. They were talking about water in the Middle East, and there's some concern that in the not so distant future, some countries are going to become like practically uninhabitable due to climate change and disparity of water. And they were talking about some of the countries like Saudi Arabia. I think UAE was another one. You see pictures of these dairy farms in Saudi Arabia. Like, what on earth are they doing? I mean, like, how can this possibly work? So you've got you've got beautiful facilities, beautiful irrigated alfalfa crops and so on, but they don't have the water to do this. But they are, because they fear not being able to access it elsewhere. And by tying up and using their water that way in such an inefficient manner, like, a desert that reaches 40 degrees Celsius isn't a place to be milking cows. They exacerbate the situation. Now, in turn, maybe this opens some opportunities for Canada, because we don't, notwithstanding the difficulties of this year, broadly speaking, we don't have, if you're in the Middle East, my goodness, you've got any number of really almost desperate challenges on a daily basis. We don't have those, and hopefully we never get them. But they're difficult. Maybe one of our opportunities is to help them.
It's an interesting point. And just back to China, you mentioned kind of stockpiling. I think that was a fear when they were buying a lot. This is pre-pandemic, that they had a significant stockpile, and their reporting wasn't quite accurate, which would be the surprise of no one. Is that clearly not the case anymore? I mean, you look at some of their export sales or their imports, like they are in a tough spot, do you think?
In China or the Middle East?
In China, sorry.
China, yeah. China can be an enigma, so stockpiling. Well, we went through, you go back a year and a half ago, and it's understood that there was some audits of publicly owned grain storages, and some of the grain was found to have spoiled or rotted or not made grade, and then some of it flooded out, as you made reference to. There was widespread unseeded acreage. So really all they were doing, the imports were predicated on building back up those stocks or making up for the unseeded acreage due to the floods and so on. No question. But then when you get into it, like Well, let's go back to pork here for a moment. So, everybody's seen, I think at this point, these pictures of hog barns that they're building that look like apartment buildings. Like one of them was going to house 6,000 sows on one site in this apartment building. They brought in French or other European pig genetics to populate those buildings. Well, they're discovering you can't feed that genetic level of pig. You're not feeding them swill.
Huh.
They need grain. Well, yeah, but China doesn't have the grain. So are they importing corn from the U.S. or barley from us or whatever to feed the pigs or to build up the storage, or are they building up extra storage because they're worried about a future embargo because of geopolitical issue? I think all these things are on the table. It's just difficult to sort through.
It's interesting. I have seen some of these videos, and I mean, I had this notion in my mind that a Chinese pork farm was pretty basic, kind of back to the land more or less. And I think to some extent that probably still exists, but these are some pretty crazy facilities. They got elevators going up and down. Like it's pretty remarkable. But that genetic piece and the feed is a really interesting concept that, I'm sure over time that they may rectify, but it's interesting to know some of those reasons that those stockpiles might be returning, and it might not just be to stockpile for future. It might be a need right now here too. Well,
one of the difficulties we have, I think, coming from a Canadian or North American perspective, is there's a tendency to think of the Chinese economy and the Chinese farm economy as being centrally planned and a bit like the Soviet Union was, and it really isn't. It's never operated that way. They always had small farms, medium-sized farms, and plenty of controls in place, but still people were still running businesses and so on. One of the difficulties they've had is, there's been this incredible, as you can imagine, when you go through 50% loss in your livestock base, a spike in price, but most of the time there's counter trends within a trend, right? So it spikes up and then it backs off by 30%, then it's up again, and it's sort of searching for a top type thing. Well, those whipsaws, a lot of the medium-sized or what you call, basic hog operations, I think a lot of them went bankrupt or were terribly financially strained through that because they had very expensive feed throughout, and the pig price whips on back and forth. So, yeah, it's almost a study unto itself to try and I don't purport to understand all of it, Brandon. I try to learn as much of it as I can because, some people I think that, well, and to be honest with you, at one time I thought this, like, look, how do we just avoid these guys? Just don't deal with them. And look, the Americans want to sell in their stuff. We'll backfill for the customers that the Americans let go, and we'll supply them. We can't do it. We can't do it. That's not going to work. We're going to have to deal with it. And it's unfortunate, but that's how it is.
That's reality. Well, Al, we got one more beer left to try here before I give you a couple big picture questions to kind of close things off here. And I did this one, you'll see, is going to be in a little bit more of a fancy receptacle this time around. This is our fourth one, is going to be the Waterloo Fest beer, which is a seasonal brewed for Oktoberfest steins. This special batch bore is brewed in honor of Oktoberfest. Made with the finest malts and hops, Fest beer is faithful to Oktoberfest tradition, full-bodied and malty, with a bready aroma and mild bitterness. So I did go ahead and bring my favorite stein here. I apologize again, I didn't send you one of those at the Thanksgiving dinner.
That's okay. Yeah, cheers.
That feels like I'm at Oktoberfest, yeah.
Yeah, I like Oktoberfest.
I imagine that's a pretty big thing down in southwestern Ontario. There's a fairly large German contingent down there, is there not?
Yeah, well, in Kitchener in particular, it's a big deal in Kitchener.
So you're going to be going over there in late September, October, whenever it's being held this year?
When I was younger, I did. I probably
Well, I know the
not so
best way
much
to feel young, Al. At least for that first night. We'll
yeah, at least for the first night. Yeah, I'll go with that.
So, like I said here, kind of a couple of big picture questions, and let's start with risk. What are the two or three biggest risks facing Canadian farmers, not just this year, not just drought, but kind of for the future of farming in Canada?
Yeah, I think the third most significant risk I'm going to say is the various and sundry risks related to trade and trade policy. So reduced or uncertain access to export markets for our products, increased domestic support outside of obligations on behalf of other countries. These are big risks for Canada, absolutely, because our programming set is predicated on other countries respecting those commitments. And, as we see the beginning of those going sideways, with an open economy, we're open to those imports. We depend on exports, can be displaced by others as a result of it. That's simply a really big risk for us. The second, or number two, as a risk, I do worry about, you raised before, sustainability issues, and I'm going to say real or perceived. There are real sustainability issues in agriculture, and I think we need to recognize those. I mentioned weed resistance. That's one. I mean, the other, a drought tolerance. The ongoing performance of whether you're talking about field crops or livestock, and the focus of breeding on productivity traits and less on what I'll call resilience traits as a result. There's the adequacy of our technologies, whether they're pesticides, pharmaceutical products, seed technology, et cetera, to cope with these range of things. Those are real issues. There's any number of others that are perceived, and of course, as you discussed, the silly stuff around glyphosate, and in Ontario we've gone through this on neonic insecticides and so on, used essentially as a wedge political topic. Those are real risks for us, and much and all, as I think trade is a big risk, I think those risks are probably even bigger. But the biggest risk, I think, is a lack of, I'm not saying that we have a lack of willingness to do this, but if we are unable to work together or unwilling to work together to tackle these issues, and collectively, then ultimately that puts our food security and to some extent global food security at risk. So really, I think the biggest risk is not being able to work together to deal with those issues.
That's a great point, and I think that's something that's been lacking in our sector to some extent, and I think is actually trending in the right direction now. I think there's a lot of realization around that need to work together and collaborate, and find allies and work on issues together. So in that vein, on the flip side, where's our biggest potential, or what are a couple of biggest areas of potential growth in helping drive post-pandemic economic recovery through agriculture in Canada?
I think it's an opportunity. I wouldn't want to suggest that it's sort of universally a good thing, but we do have a hungry world, and global hunger is reemerging, sadly. But there are countries that are concerned about food security, may even be food insecure, that have money to pay, and Canada can be a solutions provider, and we know that. It's proven. It's economic development for us. And there's a lot of good we can do in the world. And that makes me feel optimistic.
With good reason. And I know all the farmers out there listening are going to play their part, and will happily go along and sell those products around the world, and take pride in that fact that they are providing food security for people literally around the world, not just Canadians, people around the world. So Al, I have one final tough question for you here. Out of the 4 samples from Waterloo Brewing you've tried today, which is your favorite?
It's a tough question. I think I'm going to say the Rattler. And now I had the Rattler first. It's a bit sweet, but boy, on a hot day like we're having here today, did it ever cut your thirst? Boy, it was beautiful.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to go with that salted caramel. The Rattler is good on a hot day, but that was a flavor that I hadn't experienced before, and I will get more of them. I found that one to be a very good drink here. So Al, thanks so much for joining us here. I'll leave the floor to you for any final words before we exit stage today.
Well, thanks to Grain Growers of Canada, Beer Canada, Waterloo for sponsoring this. I struggle back and forth. There are so many problems in the world. Many of them are problems that in some fashion or other involve food and agriculture. But I do really believe that if we work together, there's a tremendous contribution we can make to this. And we need to remind ourselves of that.
Absolutely. And we appreciate your perspectives and all the work you do. We know we've worked with you before, and you always do fantastic work, and you're part of that solution too. So I really appreciate that, Al. So thanks so much for joining us today for this episode of Beers with Branden. I hope all listeners enjoyed it. And thanks to our presenting sponsor, Beer Canada, the voice of those who make our nation's beers. Thank you to Waterloo Brewing for providing these excellent products to taste. And I encourage you all to stop by and find out for yourself next time you're in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, or pick them up where they're available near you. And most importantly, thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another special guest. In the meantime, if you want to stay up to date with all things Grain Growers of Canada, please follow us on Twitter @GrainGrowers or on Instagram @Canada's Grain Growers. Until next time, get out there and explore more products available from Waterloo Brewing and enjoy some high quality Canadian grains in Canada's favorite summertime drink, Canadian beer. Take care.